Hello again. So now we're going to look at our fourth set of policy options to reduce climate change. This is what we call subsidies. So what's the aim of subsidies and some examples? What it's trying to do is make it more attractive for business and households to change their decisions so that they produce and purchase less polluting options relative to more polluting options. So we're looking at less polluting methods of production. So we want them, for example, to choose renewables rather than coal. We can also subsidise people to choose less pollution-intensive products. So for example, we could subsidise businesses to replace their old plant and equipment at home, our old air conditioner or washing machine, with a new piece of equipment that uses less energy. And indirectly, of course, that means less energy, less pollution. Or we could subsidise public transport, and that would be trying to encourage us to leave our car at home and use public transport. That involves less pollution. Or they could subsidise us to speed up the rate of carbon sequestration. So they could entice people to plant more forests. Or also what's important with subsidies is that you would invest in research and development to find better production methods, better substitute products that are less polluting, and cheaper ways of sequestration. So let's think of an example, subsidy to solar. So suppose under current conditions where we ignore pollution, that is, we essentially let the fumes from burning of coal and gas just go up into the atmosphere and dump it for free. And in this initial starting point, the price of electricity, PEC, produced from coal, is less than the price of electricity produced from solar, PES. So individual businesses and households would smartly say, I want the cheapest electricity, I'll take the coal-fired electricity because it's cheaper than the solar. Now we want to provide a subsidy to the solar producer and change people's decision. So suppose the subsidy is such that the price of solar, which is now more expensive than the price of coal, but with the subsidy becomes cheaper. So now it's cheaper to purchase the subsidised solar electricity rather than the polluting coal electricity. So then we would shift our decisions from coal to solar, and in the process, less pollution. So that looks like a pretty good policy idea. But note that yes, we've changed the decision to purchase solar rather than coal-fired electricity, but the price of electricity hasn't changed. In fact, it may actually fall. So there's really no incentive for businesses and households who buy electricity to change their decisions. And as we've discussed in earlier sessions, higher prices of electricity are important to millions of households to choose less polluting ways of carrying on our business and consumption. And the trouble is that there are millions and millions of ways of which we can reduce pollution. Government, in all its wisdom, can only pick a subset of those ones. They're just limited by the huge administrative cost. So it turns out not all types of pollution will get the subsidy. Another attribute of the subsidy is that government has to find the funds. That means it has to increase taxes on income, consumption, or wealth taxes. Whereas if we remember, the carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme, if it was auctioned, actually generated revenue for the government. So let's compare the price either on a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme and a subsidy. Well, yes, both do change directly affected decisions. So if we were to put a price on pollution, then that would make coal-fired pollution more expensive relative to solar. Some firms would shift from coal to solar. What the subsidy does is say, I'm going to make the solar cheaper by not changing the price of carbon or coal-fired electricity, but by lowering the price of solar electricity. The advantage of the price intervention is that it changes downstream decisions. So those people who purchase electricity now have to pay more for their electricity, and they have incentives to find more energy efficient ways of producing and running their homes. But the subsidy does not. Remember, the price of electricity at best stays the same and more likely falls. So we only get half of the sort of choice options to reduce pollution affected by the subsidy, whereas a price will affect the whole lot. And so also we will find shortly that a subsidy does not find all the cost-effective ways to reduce pollution. Only those items that are subsidised really change decisions. The others do not. It's quite likely that some decisions that would reduce pollution relatively cheaply do not get a subsidy, despite the best intentions of the best informed government. An ETS or tax generates government revenue, but a subsidy requires government revenue. So if we can illustrate these points with our diagram, again we have on our horizontal axis the total amount of pollution aggregated across all activities, and at the moment the current price of that pollution is zero, so we will operate at this point quantity business as usual. If we were to reduce pollution, then we have to change production processes, we have to buy less suitable products. It has a price. So if we were to put a price or cost on pollution, such as a tax or an emissions trading scheme, then we have this tax of 0T, say $20 per tonne, and we would reduce our pollution from quantity business as usual to Q. That's how a tax or an emissions trading scheme would operate. On the other hand, if we were to provide a subsidy, then this is our subsidy. Say this is $50 per kilowatt hour of solar. Then those activities that could reduce their pollution for less than the subsidy, these activities along here, would gain more by the subsidy than they gave up in costs, so they would reduce their amount of pollution. These activities out here that are much more expensive, the subsidy is not as big as their expense, so they would keep polluting. So again, we would get a shift in the quantity of pollution. The question is, why is the subsidy not as efficient as a price on pollution? If we think about a price on pollution, again, we're going to operate along this MAC curve where we have all activities that are involved in the pollution. On the other hand, if we're going to operate with a subsidy, remember it only picks some of the pollution activities. So it's going to be much more expensive per unit pollution if we're only picking on a subset of the pollution activities. And so the real advantage is, suppose we wanted to reduce pollution this amount to Q, if we were to use a tax, we'd need a relatively mild tax because we pick on every possible activity. On the other hand, if we wanted to get the same pollution reduction from quantity business as usual to Q with a subsidy, because it only picks on some of the activities, we're going to have a subsidy that is very much higher. And then we can also illustrate what the tax does is collect this amount of revenue, whereas the subsidy is going to require government to shell out this big amount of revenue. So in general, economists are not in favour of subsidies. But there is one important special case. This is the case of subsidies for R&D. This is to find cheaper ways of producing energy that are less pollution intensive, to find ways that are less energy intensive in business and households that reduce pollution. Now the trouble with R&D is that individual investors usually only gain a part of the total benefits. If I discover a new way and cheaper way of producing solar electricity, it isn't very long before other firms can buy my equipment and say, hey, this is cool. I'm going to do a bit of reverse engineering, and lo and behold, I also can build that new equipment, and I haven't had to spend the money on it. So we argue that if you leave research and development to the private market, then they'll underinvest. So what the aim of subsidies to R&D is to externalise the benefits that go to other firms. Now, of course, already there are subsidies for research and development. These arguments are well accepted in other forms of R&D, for biotechnology, for better machinery, better agriculture, better health, and so on. So the question, though, is there a special case for additional concessions for R&D into reducing greenhouse gas emissions? People like John Lomberg of Denmark and Ross Garner of Australia don't really answer that question, but they say, yes, there is a special case. In addition to the current tax concessions for R&D, for health and education and agriculture, I also want to do it for greenhouse gas emissions reduction, but I want to go further. I'm one who doesn't find that argument very convincing. And so I've left it as a question for you to ponder.